Today we pick up with Chapter 6, The New Industrial Age. During this time period is when we see a huge expansion of industry, and there's basically three factors behind why that is. The first is that we had a lot of natural resources here in the United States. The second is that there was a lot of inventions being made at this time. And third, we had a large population to buy all this stuff, the new inventions and the resources and all that kind of thing. So we're going to first off start looking at the natural resources. There are two main natural resources that are going to help fuel this industrial age. The first is oil, and oil was known as black gold. Kerosene could be made from oil, which is how oil was first used for us. It was fuel for lamps and lighting for factories and that kind of thing. But then Edwin L. Drake makes a steam-powered drill, and this steam-powered drill is going to make it a lot easier to get at the oil, which is going to be a huge thing because if you can get to it easier, that makes it cheaper, and so there's less cost involved. And so then we get this introduction of petroleum refineries in like Cleveland and Pittsburgh. And gasoline, which was a byproduct of making kerosene, was actually thrown away until cars became more popular, and that won't happen until like the 1900s. So just think of all the amount of gasoline that was actually thrown away because they were making kerosene. So the second of the natural resources is steel. We have lots of iron deposits here in the U.S., and iron is strong, but it's also pretty heavy, and it's kind of brittle, which means it breaks kind of easily, especially in extreme temperatures. And it also gets rusty, which means it eventually wears away. So that also can be a problem. However, once they figure out that if you take the carbon out of iron, it becomes steel, and steel is lighter, it's more flexible, and you don't have that rust problem. And so this whole process is called the Bessemer process, is where you go and you take the carbon out of the iron and you get the steel. So we see a lot of new uses for steel as a result from this. The railroad is going to be one of the biggest consumers of steel, using it for the railroad. But it's also used in things like barbed wire and a steel plow, which is going to be better than an iron plow, which could break pretty easily. We'll see it in construction purposes, like for the Brooklyn Bridge. So there's a lot of different things that it's being used for. Like I said, the second factor for the expansion of industry are inventions themselves. Electricity is going to be not so much discovered, but utilized by Thomas Edison. He's going to come up with the incandescent light bulb, and he will also come up with a system of producing and distributing electricity, which is going to totally change the business industry, the nature of business, because now you can run machines instead of hiring people. Electricity is going to become very inexpensive and convenient for production companies as well. It also changes home life, that there's going to be an increase in the number of appliances that use electricity. Street cars are going to become a mode of transportation that's going to be utilized. So it does have a huge impact on American culture and American business. Other inventions include things like the typewriter, which was introduced by Christopher Sholes, and that's going to be a huge boost, again, for business sector. The telephone, which was invented in 1876 by Alexander Graham Bell, is going to change communication. So a lot of these things are going to be very impactful on how our business runs. Other new products and changes in lifestyles that come as a result of that include like sewing machines. No more would you have hand sewn clothes, which is kind of odd because today the upper class, the upper echelon of clothing today is stuff that's hand stitched or hand sewn. But back then they were like, oh my gosh, it's made by a machine, so it's kind of a whole different mindset. Machines will be invented for heavy labor because then the workers are going to be easily replaced by these machines. But it also causes problems for the workers that are like, they lose their sense of self-worth and their sense of pride as well because of what they were doing. But other new products like the phonograph, which is something to play music, bicycles, cameras, these were all recreation kind of things that come about at this beginning or at the end of the 1800s. So, like I said, the railroad is one of the biggest consumers of steel, and so this is going to be the age of the railroads. We do get that national network, that transcontinental railroad. Starts out with the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific meeting at Promontory Point, but they continue to build and create more and more transcontinental railroads and lots of interconnections, and that's going to transform our nation. We're going to become closer as a nation because of the railroad. There's still this romance versus reality of what it was like to work with and work on the railroad. The romance was that, if you worked on the railroad, you got to travel to unsettled land. It was a fresh start. It was adventure. But the reality is that it was kind of a harsh life. You didn't get paid a whole lot. You had to work out in the harsh conditions. It's not the adventuresome lifestyle that it was portrayed as being. But one of the side benefits that comes about as a result of the railroad is that we get time zones. The railroad time, each community still kind of operated on their own time. That noon was always when the sun was at its highest point. Well, that could be different times even in the same states or in the same counties, even that they would count it just a little bit differently, even if it was off by like 5 minutes. Well, that's going to cause some problems, because if a train is leaving Remsen at noon and there's another one leaving Lamar's at 12:15, if it's off by 5 minutes, that's going to cause some problems, because what if they run into each other? So Professor C.F. Dowd is going to create these time zones. And in the U.S., continental U.S., we have 4 time zones: Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. And so it sets up a standard time for each of these time zones, and everybody runs off of that. The railroad will also provide lots of opportunities, because it does link some of those isolated cities finally to civilization, that they can get supplies, they can get news, they can travel more readily than they could before. But we do see some towns begin to specialize in certain industries. Like Chicago is going to specialize in its stockyards. Minneapolis is going to specialize in the grain industry and the grain stockyards. In Sioux City, you get the stockyards, the livestock stockyards. So they all begin to really kind of specialize in what area they want to be known for and what area they're going to attract a lot of business for. So the railroads, we know, are very, very successful, but that success can also lead to some abuses of that success. And so we're going to look at the Grange movement, and we talked about the Grange movement already, as the Grange movement was a community for the farmers. And typically they were unhappy with the railroad because of its abuses. There was misuse of government land grants. A lot of those land grants that were intended to go to settlers, to go to farmers, actually ended up going to the railroad. And so they bought some of the best land that could have been used for farmland. They didn't like the fact that the railroad charged different rates for different customers. Depending on if you bribed them or not, you could get different rates on your transportation fees. And so the Grangers, or the Grange movement, is going to try and pass Granger laws. And these Granger laws are going to press the states to establish laws forbidding excessive rates for passengers and freight. That they wanted a set limit. They didn't want to see a whole ton of overcharging, overpricing. And so they're going to ask the states to pass these laws. And some of these states passed the laws. But then they create the Interstate Commerce Act. And the Interstate Commerce Act kind of did that same thing of forbidding the railroads from charging excessive rates. However, the railroads are going to challenge it, and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is going to rule that the states cannot set the rates, because railroads go between the states. It goes from one state to another state, and so the states can't set the rates. And so the Interstate Commerce Act is going to give that right to the federal government. So instead of the states doing it, the federal government's supposed to do it. The only problem is that a lot of times the railroads are going to bribe the federal government, and they get away with it. They continue to get away with it. So we're going to see that becoming kind of a problem when big business gets a little too involved. And so we will pick that up with our next section.